There is a huge environmental impact, and we don't have time. We need to do this now.
Those subsidies are not benefiting to the right people.
We can reinvest the money from fossil fuel subsidies into clean energy.
How do we scale up the clean energy revolution? So, welcome everybody to what is the third episode of what we're calling the Dino Talks, which is brought to you by We Don't Have Time TV and the UN Development Programme. I'm Nick Nuttall, I'm with We Don't Have Time, and later on the show we will have my co-host, who is Boaz Paldi, and he is with the UN Development Programme as the Global Partnerships and Campaigns Manager, and he's also a former TV journalist.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Just before COP26, I think many people saw this fantastic video that went viral around the world, produced by UNDP, of Frankie the Dinosaur going into the UN General Assembly and telling world leaders, don't choose extinction. And this is a campaign led by UNDP, which is about how to address fossil fuel subsidies around the world. And We Don't Have Time really found this absolutely fascinating. And at COP26 every night, we had a counter behind us on our stage when we were broadcasting, which was counting up the amount of money that governments were spending on fossil fuel subsidies, but also on, in a sense, subsidizing the damage that climate change is causing linked with the use of fossil fuel subsidies. The reaction from all guests was universal. This is absolutely crazy. And of course it is, because with the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we're trying to save our world and its people by, in part, decarbonizing the global economy. And yet, on the other hand, we're actually funding the very fuels which are at the heart of this challenge. In the series of 10 episodes, we're looking at all aspects of the fossil fuel subsidy story, or as much as we can. And hopefully at the end of this show, we'll have more engaged people around the world and citizens, but also hopefully we'll have more engaged governments who are actually going to do something about it. In our first show, we looked at what are fossil fuel subsidies. In the second show, we looked a little bit at some of the choices we could make to better spend this money on renewable energy, but also on nature-based solutions. Today, we're going to have a look at what have governments been doing to try and address this problem, because governments have been trying, and we'll have a look at a couple of case studies, more than a couple of case studies, in fact, to see how this has gone. I'd like to ask the audience to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org. And I'd also like to thank Prime Computer, who's a partner with We Don't Have Time, who is actually supporting these 10 episodes. Okay, let's get this show rolling. I'm first going to introduce you to Lourdes Sanchez. She's a senior policy advisor working with the International Institute for Sustainable Development's energy program, and she's actually a Spanish national, although she's lived in many other parts of the world, as I've seen from her CV. Her research focuses on the analysis of energy subsidies, both electricity and fossil fuels, the evaluation and design of sustainable energy policy reforms, and on developing communication strategies for energy subsidy changes. Lourdes, we're going to ask you to give us a glimpse into 3 case studies of 3 governments that actually tried to deal with this problem. I understand you're going to look at Indonesia, Mexico, and Guinea-Conakry. So you have the floor, Lourdes.
Thank you very much, Nick, and pleasure to share about this very interesting topic. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Indonesia first because it's the first one comes in the timeline. Also because it's the positive one, we can say, at least for the period that the reforms last. So basically, Indonesia, since the beginning of 2000, they were spending a lot of money on subsidizing diesel and gasoline. So that was around 1 to 4% of the GDP of the country every year going into subsidies to these fuels. So in 2015, President Jokowi decided to reform these subsidies. And basically, they did it at the same time as the international oil prices went down, so by the 1st of January to 2015. So it was a very wise movement because the population didn't really see much of a change. And at the same time, actually, they did a lot. They managed to get a lot of savings thanks to this reform. So when they revised the budget for that year, basically they identified savings of around $15 billion for that year alone. And they used a big part of this money to promote infrastructure development, also rural development, and eradicate poverty. And at the same time, the country had already very strong social protection programs that they also used in order to support the population that could be affected by these kind of changes of reforms. So that was actually a positive case, although in 2016, 2017, when international prices started going up again, and also the election process or the period started again, these subsidies actually were revoked, unfortunately. But at least there was a good lesson from there. The other countries you mentioned, Mexico and Guinea, they're actually a little bit less positive, but at the same time, they allow us also to learn a lot from them. So Mexico, for example, they, actually a decade ago, more or less, they started implementing a package of massive reforms of their whole energy system. So both fossil fuels, but also electricity. And actually fossil fuel subsidy reform, at least subsidies to gasoline and diesel was a big part of that. So same thing, they used to have fixed prices for gasoline and diesel. And then in 2015, they realized that was very expensive to the federal government. So they implemented a system, a formula, pricing formula that will allow fluctuations according to the international market, but at the same time, they will establish a cap and a floor. So that in the end, it kept on costing money to the government. It wasn't as successful in that aspect as they thought. So by the 1st of January 2017, the government decided to fully liberalize the gasoline and diesel prices. And actually, that happened, unfortunately, at the same time as the Mexican peso devaluated and also the international oil prices went up. So the opposite to Indonesia. So this resulted in increase of gasoline and diesel prices by up to 20%. So that was obviously not very welcome by the Mexican population. And there were a series of protests, they were called locally the gasolinazo. So, as a reaction, the government implemented a more smooth plan for the reform. And since then, actually, in the end, the prices have been reformed. So the prices, the gasoline and diesel prices reflect the international variations. And the last case, Guinea, is actually quite similar to Mexico. In this case, same thing. Prices were fixed for many years, costing a lot of money to the government. So the government decided to also, there was a set of reforms within the energy sector, and they decided to implement a new pricing formula that will reflect somehow in a smooth way, but somehow the international price variations. What happened is the moment they implemented this formula for the first time, there was also a very big increase. So prices of gasoline and diesel increased by 25%. And same thing, population wasn't very happy with that. There were demonstrations. Actually, for some of them, I was in Conakry, in the capital city. So I saw how they were very strong ones, actually. But actually, what is interesting is like that was used by many opposition groups to basically show their discontent with the ruling government. So it was not only because of the price increases, it was also because many other factors. So that's also a classical example, actually, of demonstrations when fossil fuel subsidy reform appears. Well, in this case, same thing. The government basically, I mean, these reactions trigger a series of explanations from the government to different, important groups, or like basically the stakeholders that were affected by these changes, and they continued actually the evolution of the prices according to the markets, but with much smaller changes. So those are kind of the three main examples.
Wow, that's a whip through 3 countries and their attempts to reform fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you very much indeed, Lourdes. Let's go to our second speaker. The second speaker is, I promised to pronounce this lady's name right, because as a Brit, we always get French-sounding names wrong. So if I make a mistake, Nathalie, forgive me and just clarify it for me. It's Nathalie Giroux.
Giroir.
Giroir, fantastic. She's head of the Division for Environmental Performance and Information in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And among her many laurels, she oversees the OECD's Fossil Fuel Support Intelligence Unit, and she's a Canadian national. Nathalie, you're going to present a kind of bridge, in a sense, between what Lourdes said by talking a bit more about Indonesia, which of course is the president of the G20 this year, which is why it's also a very interesting study. And you're also going to look at a developed country, a richer country, the Netherlands, what they've done, and also the Ukraine, because there's some interesting stories there too. Thanks very much, and over to you, Nathalie.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Well, I wanted to follow up on what Lourdes mentioned regarding Indonesia experience with reforming fossil fuel subsidy, because like her, we also see some very positive lessons to learn. Actually, they have tried to make subsidy removals before the 2015 reform, and that triggered really massive social unrest in 1998, in 2005, in 2008, and other years following that. So it has been really a delicate socio-political dimension of subsidy reform in this country. And what they did that was really nice is that they crafted a very well-designed communication strategy where they were explaining the reasons behind and the benefits that the population would gain so that they could build support for fossil fuel report. And so they had campaigns, they had educational programs, they wanted to inform the people about the measures that the government will implement and put in place to really alleviate the burden of the most vulnerable sectors and the most vulnerable population after the subsidy reform. So political, business, social leaders, as well as academics spoke about the inefficiencies of those subsidies that was aggravating pollution, that was being a stain on public budgets, and that was draining fiscal resources, and that could be invested in education instead, in skills and in physical infrastructure. So really a fantastic success with their communication strategy, avoided another backlash on the population and on the economy. And then I would like to give a few insights about the Netherlands. So the Netherlands has been a major producer and also an exporter of natural gas since in the 1950s 60s, they developed their large Groningen field. Of course, the share of natural gas has decreased because now they have much more renewable energy, but still it's more than 40% of their energy supply. And the example I want to bring here, the good practice, is share the continuous evaluation that the energy tax expenditure and subsidy program that is being done by the government. So I see this as really an important tool to drive fossil fuel subsidy report. So what they do is that they use those spending reviews to improve the priorities for spending across all the government. So they do periodic evaluations of tax expenditure, subsidy program, and that's integrated in the general budgetary planning process of the government. And they see this as a good practice for transparency and also for policy design. So every 4 to 7 years, they have an evaluation process and they look at factors for success, reasons for insufficient effectiveness and efficiency, and also unintended consequences of government policy. And that serves to inform the reform. And those spending reviews have led to the elimination of multiple tax expenditure that was providing support for fossil fuels and targeted the wrong users and considered ineffective. So that's really something that other countries could look at for improving their policy design. And there's also another good practice from the Netherlands that is worth highlighting here, is that they have undertaken a peer review of their fossil fuel subsidy that was coordinated by the International Energy Agency and the OECD. And the outcome of this exercise concluded with the government sending a letter to the Dutch Parliament in September 2020, asking to review 13 support measures for fossil fuels. And in that, they have identified oil and gas extraction support, energy tax exemptions in sectors such as horticulture, energy intensive processes, electricity generation, and so on. And the few takeaways from this peer review exercise is that it really helped to gain clarity on the potential winners and also the losers from the reform that were proposed. For instance, it made it clear that the tax exemptions and the reduction for the industries, they were maintained to lower the natural gas prices for the domestic industry, for instance. And another takeaway is that the government didn't consider lower tax rates on natural gas for energy intensive consumer to be a subsidy. And as such, there was no account of the fiscal cost of that specific lower tax rate. So there, if you have a clear definition and an agreed definition of what is a fossil fuel subsidy, it could have important implication to identify the foregone revenues, in this case here for the lower tax rates on natural gas. And then another thing that the Dutch did really well is that they included in their self-report the energy tax structure. So that was really helpful to identify the burden between industry and household. So broadening the scope of information around the tax structure really helped to see where's the trade-off. So clearly for us, the Netherlands moved very assertively to phase out their fossil fuel subsidy, also because they are committed to align their energy system with their climate and low energy transition objectives. And that seems like, good way to go. Then after that, there is the example of Ukraine. Ukraine's subsidy reform did really well because they managed to avoid a fuel price shock that could have also here led to serious social disruption. So how did they do this? They targeted very successfully social protection measures towards the most vulnerable household and sector. And that is also a lesson that is worth hearing. So we did a study looking at Ukraine that was before the COVID-19 crisis. And what we saw is that the bulk of their subsidies, they go to natural gas. This is dominating the energy mix. This is used for generating heat and electricity. And before the reform in 2014, most of the energy prices were really below market tariffs. So the government started a wide-ranging subsidy reform for 2 years, from 2014 to 2016. And during that period, natural gas prices increased like more than eightfold, and electricity tariffs more than threefold. And this reform was all the more important because Russia was canceling Ukraine natural gas discount. So they needed to find some savings there. So it was, as I said, a great success because it avoided this fabulous price shock that came in and didn't have any social unrest. So their social program, which is called Energy Assistance Program, with the housing utility subsidy, is unique because it combines not only income assessment, which is a criteria that is used to test, but also expected volume of energy consumption. And mixing these and really targeting precisely the vulnerable people didn't create any major social disruption like we have seen in other countries who have attempted to scrap fossil fuels, and what Lourdes mentioned actually. And most recently, at the COP26 in Glasgow, Ukraine became a member of the Powering Past Cold Alliance, and also announced a target year of 2025 for its complete decommissioning of a coal-fired thermal power plant. So really going towards the decarbonization of the energy sector. So I think that Ukraine has made important reforms and commitment, and they're leading to a much better use of the public funds that they have for the people and also for the benefit of the planet.
Super. Well, look, thank you, Lourdes. Thank you, Natalie. That's great. That was a really good whiz through 5 countries. Thank you very much indeed. Let me bring in Boaz here, who is my partner in crime, co-hosting this series. And Boaz, maybe you could give us a little reflection on some of the things you've heard from our two great speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. For us at UNDP, we launched the Don't Choose Extinction campaign with the idea of two dual important issues. One, of course, of decarbonization, green transition, and of course, fossil fuel subsidy reform at the heart of it. But the second is inequality. And what you both have very, very clearly said is that second part is the vital, X factor or the secret sauce to making reform work in countries, to making it palatable to the population, so the poorest and the most disenfranchised do not get left with the highest burden of the price. And so it's great to hear these examples from you, and also great to learn the lessons from the ones that didn't work. We see a lot of countries trying to do this, and we had our first speaker, which is UNDP's chief economist George Molina Gray, talk about the idea that when governments try and reform for austerity measures, and that always backfires and it doesn't really work. Bringing those two together into some kind of social protection seems to be the winning formula here. Would Natalie and Lourdes, would you agree with that's the way that we have to move forward, is to look at populations, look at the vulnerabilities, and try and address those vulnerabilities while we reform, rather than ignore that and just move forward?
So indeed, it's a key element of any reform of, especially of subsidies to fossil fuels. But I would say it's not the only one, actually. I mean, for example, we have seen in some of the cases we have discussed is the communication side also is key. And probably I didn't emphasize that enough. but the fact that the population is aware not only of the plus and minus of the fossil fuel subsidies and why they are, well, regressive, even if it's a complex concept, but also what are the mechanisms that they have at their disposal or they can make use of to be compensated or like to mitigate the effects of the price increases. So indeed, and I would add also the planning of the whole reform, that of course a key element again is considering the social side of that, so the impacts on the poor and vulnerable. But I think that those are the main elements of a successful reform, and of course the social protection side is key.
Yeah, I think I agree that it's really an important component for success, but it's not easy because to have really the properly targeted people and not have, distortion, which those subsidies are not benefiting to the right people. You need to have a very granular set of data, and you need to re-examine your subsidies on a regular basis. Are they still meeting the objective they were supposed to meet? And is this the best way to protect those vulnerable people? Wouldn't there be any other alternatives that would be better? But there are some people that do need those subsidies. There are some sectors that also need some protection. So we're not claiming that everything should disappear, but they should be targeted to the right people and the right sector.
If you don't, if I may just follow up, it seems like the price of fuel. It was very low last year. It's gone up this year. Obviously, fossil fuel subsidies will go up with it. But looking at the future, we don't really see a downward turn anymore of fossil fuel energy. We may be looking at a situation where oil barrels are at $90 all the time, and so governments might not have the choices that Indonesia has in finding the right moment in time when fuel is cheap, and so therefore they can do the reform there. Is there a way for governments to prepare themselves otherwise for a situation in the world where price of fuel is actually at a high level almost all the time? Is there what should governments be thinking about around that issue of this is the price of fuel, the real price of fuel?
I think that that's a very important question. Also, because if you start a reform when the price of fuel is low, it's easy. But if your reform is not well crafted and not spread over time correctly, as soon as the price will rise, you'll get into problems again. So it's not evident for me that the best time for reform is when prices are low because of the volatility of those world prices. So again, it needs to be integrated into a larger energy reform or a larger reform. It needs to be staged, and it takes time. I mean, this is not done in a year or two. It's something that needs to be done over a longer period and be adjusted. So there's no secret formula for that, but really that's how I see it.
Lourdes, have you got some thoughts on that?
Sure. So, well, two main things. So one, actually, I will get back to Natalie's point before about the targeting, so the importance of that. Because again, not everybody is going to suffer the same way when prices are high. So some people are really going to see that, but both, because of direct consumers, but also indirectly through inflationary effects. Because if cost of transport, for example, increases, then the cost of food can increase, cost of energy in general, etc. Like electricity, for example. So targeting is one of the things. And the other thing also, again, I agree very much with Natalie in the sense that we have to face actually reforms in times when prices are high. And for that, actually, same thing. There are different mechanisms, different things that governments can do. Well, first is planning again. So do that in a gradual way. So that's one thing that big bang, as we call them, type of reforms are not welcome in general. So when things happen suddenly, obviously the population is not going to like it. So a gradual reform is a good mechanism. I mean, it's something that governments can do. And at the same time, there are actually many type of pricing formulas that can help with in this transition period, let's say. So I didn't get much into the technicalities of the Mexico and Guinea cases, but both actually they have price smoothing mechanisms. So Guinea, basically they have a formula, at least at the time, that was considering the last 3 months of oil prices. So that changes will not be completely suddenly reflected. And also that since it was based on the past, the population could kind of see, okay, last month the price went to, I'm saying whatever, $150 the barrel, then it's going to be an increase. And they can, advance. And then also Mexico, what they have is this kind of tax that helps also mitigate a little bit the price variations. So that's another example. And there are many other systems there. So the governments are definitely encouraged to look at the options and define formulas that can help them go ahead with this reform, even when prices are high.
Just to jump in here a little bit, it's quite funny now because we're really boiling down into the complexity of how governments, are going to deal with this and the political dimensions and targeting the poor. But of course, if climate change is allowed to rise well beyond 1.5, the economic costs are going to be absolutely huge, aren't they? And then nobody's going to remember that they were arguing over oil at this price and oil at that price and how it affected the economy. The whole world will be in trouble. So isn't the bridge here is the best way to get rid of fossil fuels is a massive ramp up of clean energy, much faster than we've ever seen in the history of the world, almost like a war footing, right? That we need to ramp up the renewable energy and also the other options that are needed. I'm in Spain right now. I'm at my son's near Alicante in a remote community. There's no bus, right? So even though my daughter-in-law would love to go to work on the bus, she has to go by car. So she has to, in this case, use a fossil fuel powered car. It's just the alternatives are so slow to actually overwhelm the use of fossil fuels right now. Is this something that we should be thinking about? How do we scale up the clean energy revolution? How do we scale up the clean transportation revolution? How do we scale up more people living in compact cities? Or is this beyond our conversation right now? It just strikes me that we're now talking about the future of the world.
And I wonder if I could just add into that one other element, which is, could we, in effect, and we use those same funds that are being used for fossil fuel subsidies in order to build those green job schemes, that green energy economy? Could that be a transfer? Could it be that governments have a blend of social protection plus green jobs to try this reform process? Is that something that you've looked at, and is that a viable option? In our previous episode, in episode 2, we had 2 guests that were talking about the price of green energy and of nature-based solutions. Both of those seems to be part of the equation, and seems to be that we should be looking at that as well.
Maybe I can start. I think that indeed, if we want to achieve a lasting fossil fuel subsidy reform, we need for that to accelerate decarbonization of a country energy mix. That's the best way to do it. If we decrease the dependency to fossil fuel and increase the uptake of renewable energy, this is going to reduce the base on where a country could subsidize fossil fuel. That's mechanical. But adding to that, I think that clearly now fossil fuel subsidy reform has been now acknowledged as a real mitigation measure. Fossil fuel subsidy reform is a mitigation measure to limit climate change. So it should really be part of all packages to go towards net zero and accompany the Paris Agreement commitment. So that is really the new way of seeing things that will help countries make sure that they put in place a carbon price, but on the other side, they stop subsidizing fossil fuels so that we go in the right direction. And also because what we have seen from the recovery packages is that not so much effort has been put into the green side of the reform and the building back better. A substantial amount have been put into a fossil fuel industry, which is really a missed opportunity to accelerate the transition to develop renewable energy, where we know that there are some great space for new jobs there. So this is the way that should a government advance, and of course opportunities for these jobs will be developing as we build in a cleaner economy with new technologies, with innovation. There will be, of course, some reallocations of jobs from some sectors that are energy intensive to others which are greener. I think that we cannot close our eyes on that. But with accompanying measures and with the proper monitoring of the situation, there are really some gains and some retraining that could be made to workers to help us to accelerate the transition towards net zero.
Lourdes, any thoughts there? And also just building on that, we talked about all the some countries that have tried to do it, and it's kind of like they were doing maybe well and then maybe not so well, and I presume that there's probably some political football attached to fossil fuel subsidies, that different governments promise the earth in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, and others promise to give away the earth by increasing fossil fuel subsidies. But I mean, is there anybody, not exactly a poster child, but scanning around the globe, is there one country that comes to mind where they've done better than anybody else? Or is there no such country?
I mean, I'd say there are actually many countries that have done reforms that were successful, at least for a period. I mean, we cannot forget this is actually a very sensitive topic. I mean, I think this podcast that this broadcast had actually brought already enough information to understand that now. But at the same time, there are many examples of reforms that worked, and actually probably linking with the previous point and also what Boaz was mentioning about the fact that we can reinvest the money from fossil fuel subsidies into clean energy. Some countries have done things like that. So we have this concept that the ISD called the swaps, the subsidy swap. It's exactly that, moving from one to the other. And at a smaller scale, there are countries like Morocco and Zambia that have done it. We saw Indonesia also. There was a part of the phase that was successful. Now the main thing is like achieving a durable reform. Well, I mean, again, Mexico still has the liberalized prices. So I think it's, I mean, there are more examples probably of things that have worked out in the end, in the long term, than what we think. At the same time, it's true that the perfect example where the reform was implemented properly, where the population took it in a good way, where the right mechanisms were there, the right communications campaign, and then on top the reform was long lasting. Probably that's a bit more complicated to find. But I think, yeah, taking bits and pieces of what the different countries have done for good, it's a very good starting point.
So, Boaz, there is hope. There is hope here. We've learned a lot, and there is hope.
It seems that way. It seems that there is hope. I think, what is extremely important, and I come back to what Lourdes and Nathalie said, is informing people. Like it's that educational piece. It's the idea that social fuel subsidy reforms are a complicated issue. They're complex. Many people don't realize that their governments are actually, in fact, paying those subsidies with their tax dollars. And so that educational piece is extremely important for us to reach as many people as possible. That's why we hope that this broadcast reaches as many people as possible, and bring along those people and make them understand that there is an there's a financial impact, but there is a huge environmental impact, and we don't have time. We need to do this now. We need to move towards these reforms as quickly as possible. And hearing from Natalie and from Lourdes, it seems like governments do have choices that can work.
Good. Well, I think we've come to the end of the show. Thank you very much indeed, Lourdes and Natalie. That was really great stuff. Thank you for being in our third episode of the 10-part Dino Talks. Thank you very much indeed, Boaz, for being with us and helping so much there being a great co-presenter. And we look forward to our fourth episode, which will obviously come after the third episode. And we hope everybody comes along on that ride as well. And thank you again to Prime Computer, a partner of UNEP. I used to work for UNEP. We don't have time. Who is generously backing these series. Okay, thanks very much indeed, and have a super day.
We believe by rewarding climate solutions and warning all the polluters, we will make it profitable to save our planet and super expensive to destroy it.
We must now zoom in on the quality and the implementation of plans, on measuring and analyzing, on reporting, transparency and accountability.
We want to be better, and that's why we are open for climate dialogue.
We want to know what you think, and so that we can improve.
Let's give climate love to those that have the solutions. And let's send climate warning to those that needs to change.
That's we don't have time, because actually I agree, we don't have time.
We're trying to reduce CO2 collectively.
If we don't act urgently and quickly, catching up later won't work.
The drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century.
We had about $350 billion of direct subsidies and tax expenditures, tax breaks given to fossil fuels.
Have such an enormous mobilization of business, finance, civil society, and science all gathered here.
We have halved our own emissions between 2012 and 2017 and are now at a 70% reduction.
SSAB has decided to be the first steel company in the world to offer fossil-free steel to the market in just a few years.
There's lack of clarity, and it just feeds greenwashing and delays meaningful action.
We just have to go quickly. We have the technology. We don't have to develop technology.
We're going to create this huge wealth transfer from energy producers, who represent a tiny minority of people, to energy consumers, who represent all people.
We are in a climate emergency, and we are very far from where we need to be.
Get ahead of the curve or you're going to lose.
I was able to attend one demonstration that kicked off at Kelvin Grove all the way to George Square, and we had a lot of activists.
What I feel that I can bring is a young audience that maybe doesn't know what to think about climate change.
What is happening here, negotiating, it's so wrong from our perspective. You don't put a price on your mother.
Now, personally, I don't believe the fossil fuel industry should continue to be allowed to operate the way it's been operating for the last several decades.
We want to bring a voice to all the new solutions, the new ideas, the new entrepreneurs who are out there trying to kind of make a break and create this new climate economy.
They're setting a great example, and there's lots of other big businesses that should follow their example.
I really want to urge everybody just to be thinking more about land use and not just electrifying vehicles to, maintain the environment that got us here today.
They want to ban the word burgers, sausages, and steaks from being used on vegan and vegetarian products.
Tell them what they do so that they will be encouraged to do more. And together with the community or users, we share this to millions of people on social media, so this is getting noticed.
Let's bring in Shweta Chakrabarty tonight, risk and behavioral scientist and president of U.S. operations for We Don't Have Time.
As the name says, we don't have time.
ستوكهولم مؤسس منظمة ليس لدينا الوقت. We don't have time. السيد إنغمار رونسبورغ.
Joining us for more as We Don't Have Time's Nick Nuttall. Nick, welcome to the program.
And Nick, about this counter, speaking of numbers.
This is a clock that shows you how much money has been spent on fossil fuel subsidies since the beginning of the COP.
We have a climate crisis and we're still subsidizing the industry which is causing the crisis. I mean, it's completely dumb. I'm a finance guy, it makes no sense whatsoever.
$2.5 trillion went into subsidies for fossil fuel. That's a definition of insanity.
Still, this is a positive. It's the first COP decision that actually mentions coal power or fossil fuel subsidies.
We need to communicate climate action. Because if only a few people or a few companies are doing climate action without communicating it to others, we will not solve the climate crisis.